Everybody. Well, we better make a start. Apologies from Julie on a boat somewhere. We've got Eileen here. Where's Eileen? Hello, Eileen. And in attendance, Fraser. Any declarations of interest other than those on the register, or anything new on the register that people want to flag? Okay. And we are very correct. Okay, so I'm going to do my thing now, even though there's nobody here to share this. So, so we're puffing up our chests with pride, aren't we? And celebrations, the greatness of our national institution. And so half the room think I'm talking about the football, don't they? And the other half know I'm talking about our birthday, the NHS's 70th birthday. So, so to all the people working in the NHS, making a difference every day to patients' lives, I'm just going to say thank you. You know, we're all going to need healthcare at some point in our lives. And it's a privilege to work in a CCG where I know everybody is working towards doing really good stuff for patients out there to make their healthcare better. And everybody here wants to contribute to the future of the NHS. So, you know, we've had 70 years, but let's hope we've got another 70 years of greatness as well. So, happy birthday to us. Okay. So, on we go. Shall we do the minutes of, we've got two lots, haven't we? We've got the 6th of June, which was the last board meeting, and then we've got the 22nd of May, which was the extraordinary board meeting we had. So let's do the 6th of June first. Anything on accuracy for that one? Stephen?
Yes. On page 2 or page 11, the annual report and accounts, it says in line 2, there was an extraordinary audit stroke finance committee meeting. It's actually an extraordinary audit committee meeting, not finance.
Correct,
So
yeah.
the word finance could be deleted.
Good. Anything else on accuracy? No. Are there any actions or matters arising? I think not. Good. Thank you for those. And then the extraordinary May meeting. Anything on accuracy from that meeting, Stephen?
At the top of page 2 or page 18, it says NJ handed over to SH. I don't think that's correct. I think you remained as chair. You invited me to report, as it were, for the audit committee,
yes.
but you didn't hand over the meeting to me.
Correct, yes. Thank you. Let me just correct that. Anything else? No? Jolly good. Thank you for those. Do we have any items of any other business that we already know about? No. Good, thank you. So, so the bulk of this meeting then, apart from some of the formal reporting really, is on our clinical focus, which is the health and care plan, and we've got a presentation from Josh. Are you? Sandy's going to do that. Are they coming in? They're in the building here. Oh no. Thank you. Would you like to do a quick intro on it, or do you want to wait till we get here? Yeah.
So this presentation and this discussion is part of reflection on some of the really excellent work that the CCG has done with London Borough of Wandsworth over the last few years, connected to policy like the Better Care Fund, but more crucially, I think, around some of the work around some of our most at-risk, frail, ill people in the borough. I guess the only thing I'd say ahead of the presentation is, given some of the mood music from the centre following the new NHS plan, health and social care integration continues, I think, rightly to be a really significant focus from central government, and I think that aligns very well with what we're doing, so the governing body may want to reflect on this and think about further opportunities for the future. And without further ado, here is Sandy and Sydney. Fantastic. Look at that. Timing impeccable. Very integrated.
Thank you, ladies. Sorry, we did the first bit a bit quicker than anticipated. So, that's all right. Take your time. Fine.
No,
No, I think it'll be all right, Sydney, actually. Although if you got copies of the slides, so you're not craning your neck backwards, okay, that's cool. No, that's all right.
Hi.
That's right. Do you want to introduce yourselves to us? Thank you.
My name is Sandy King. I'm head of education and care at Wandsworth. Oh, do I need this? Yes. Yeah. I forgot that. Yes. Okay. Hello, I'm Sandy Keane, head of older people and integrated care at Wandsworth CCG.
And I'm Sydney Hill, Head of Health and Care Strategy for Wandsworth and Richmond Adult Social Services.
Great. Okay. So,
I'm starting off. So we're just having a presentation around the health and care integration. This is an evolving agenda for both the CCG and borough councils. Just to go, who are you doing slides? Overview of what we're going to cover is the national context and drivers, differences and similarities between adult social care and health, the benefits to patients and residents around having more integrated models of working, what we're currently doing to integrate through our Better Care Fund, what our key achievements are, the local challenges and opportunities, and then future plans. The national aspiration, so we're still waiting for the green paper in the autumn and NHS plans in the autumn to really set the more sort of national context. But what we do know is that there's a big driver towards more integration with having a single effective delivery system which provides seamless care to vulnerable and unwell people. And a system that's really centred around the person and around what works for our residents and less around organisational boundaries. It's provided at the right time, in the right place, in the right way. It avoids duplication, is joined up and complementary, and it enables and promotes self-care and preventative support. And really looking at focusing targeted interventions for people who need it most. And the BCF, we think, is a vehicle that we can use to drive this. Adult social care context. So in adult social services, we're a locality-based system that is provided by local organisations, so the council. It's set in a political context under locally elected political leadership. And so key decisions and strategic direction are set by elected members. It's not directed by a corporate centre such as the NHS. There's an eligibility test to access most of our statutory services are through an eligibility decision. And it's not free. Most of our statutory services are also means tested. And that's ranging from a small cost, nil cost, to paying the full amount of someone's adult social care. The NHS context you should be quite familiar with, but NHS care is free at the point of need and is not means tested. The CCG is Commissioner's clinically led organisation governed by local GPs. However, the broader NHS context is the expectation nationally consistent services. And so you have a lot of top-down targets and regulation. Commissioning at a range of levels, so commissioning for an individual, so around continuing healthcare packages, compared to commissioning at large scale, such as the acute trusts. And focus on healthcare provision, but much demand is determined by wider determinants, so affluence, housing, lifestyle, social isolation. Looking at the similarities and differences between adult social care and health, we covered really around what the key difference is, but similarities, we're still both looking at delivering high quality, person-led care that is safe and effective, supporting people to live with independence and dignity, holistically assessing physical and mental health across someone's life. We have a range of services that are focused on providing advice and information. We provide short-term support as well as long-term support to meet people's complex health and care needs. We have safeguarding duties towards vulnerable adults to safeguard them from abuse and neglect. And we also commission a range of services, and there's similar commissioning patterns across health and social care. So how we can work together, we have difference in the statutory functions that we have from the NHS and social care, but there's also a lot of overlap and areas that we can do more work together. And that's focusing on prevention, improving keeping people well and at home, rehabilitation, reablement and rehabilitation services, supporting our provider markets, market sustainability, and that includes quality assurance of those providers, efficiency of care provision, and through planning together. This just shows, demonstrates a simple social care model around how adult social services are the functions of adult social services. And it also broadly shows how Wandsworth adult social services teams are set up. But for me, what this shows is each of these functions, there's a real opportunity to have health and care integration at each one of those stages. So whether or not that's through commissioning of the voluntary sector to focus on prevention, our access points and how we give advice and information and signposts, especially around hospital discharge and our hospital teams, our reablement offer, our complex long-term support that we work with people with either learning disabilities, mental health problems, or older people, physical disabilities. And then lastly, how we regularly monitor and review people who have access to health and social care services. And this diagram just sort of shows some of the complexity of the current context that we're working in across southwest London. We have, from a borough perspective, Richmond and Wandsworth adult social services working across a shared staffing arrangement. We have Merton and Wandsworth CCGs working in the local delivery unit. There's lots of work that's happening across southwest London at scale. Including St George's Mental Health Trust being a provider across southwest London. And there's real advantages locally around our community work and hospital discharge work with Merton and Wandsworth feeding into St George's Hospital and having the same community health provider. And we're doing some work across southwest London from an adult social services perspective as well.
Excellent. I'll hand the mouse to you then. Okay, we're just splitting it up. So I'm moving over to the integration through the Better Care Fund and what we've actually achieved. Obviously, we have a Section 75 agreement, which is now to the value of 31 million, which has recently been injected through a new grant, which was an IBCF money, it's called, but it's still accountable through the BCF. But I understand from the council that will be decreasing over time, but we have got an injection for 3 to 4 years, which is really helpful. Obviously, the council and the CCG have significant financial pressures, so even though that money is there, there's a lot of pressure on it, isn't there? And going forward. So I suppose really the question for us in terms of integration is what can we do to really look at those cost pressures together through and to address those challenges through integration. It's really great that both myself and Sydney have integrating roles, if you like. Sydney's just gone into a new role, which is wonderful, which is Head of Health and Care Strategy, which is quite a different role, I would say, from other roles in the council we've had in the past. And obviously I'm also Head of Integrated Care. So I think we're both sort of aligning in terms of our roles, which is really useful. So obviously, our biggest investment in the BCF in the last 2 years has been the ECP, the Enhanced Care Pathway. Do lots of people already know about this? Okay, I'll be very quick. In terms of, we identified 500 people who are the most vulnerable, and we look to extend to 800 this year, but in fact, I think we ended up with just 500, didn't we? Yes. I think with the change of community provider, and we realised actually 500 was the core vulnerable group that we really needed to focus on. And we have 80, it's not 80 MDT meetings, it's 80 people we discuss at MDT meetings per month. Otherwise, that really would be too many meetings. We have enough already. And obviously, you can see the range of people that attend those meetings and how important that is to really address people's who are vulnerable, and how we can best meet their needs. And we've started to show a real reduction in the number of admissions that we're having. You can see that the average age is between 80 and 84 years, with 8 long-term conditions on average, and 47% have depression as well, and 0.5% a learning disability. And in terms of the outcomes, you can see that the reductions is quite significant. It's around 25%, I think, but 37% in the first year. I think the second year was a little less because I think you've had that sort of peak with the same patients. I think it was really nice to have some patient quotes as well. My daughter and granddad are very involved in my care and along with me make decisions. All staff are on the ball, and I think Mum has become a VIP at the surgery. I can go out and they tailor my care that suits me and around my appointments, which I go to with my daughter. So I thought that was quite nice in terms of understanding the impact it's had. So in terms of achieving the BCF high impact changes, are everyone aware of those? We have sort of a list that we're given in terms of a delivery for Better Care Fund. So you can see the green are the delivery areas that we need to be looking at. So early discharge planning. So we're lucky now that St George's have a transformation team leading on improvements in discharge, which has been in place since October. And as a result of that, we now have really good electronic tracking for patient flow at St George's, so we're really able to see good data. And we have a single point of access in the community health services, which started in October as well. Obviously, we are looking at multi-agency discharge teams, including voluntary and community sector. I think we have to an extent through the GP Federation, that integration, but we need to do more of that across health and social care going forward. And we have, in terms of our discharge to assess processes, we've started to do that with continuing healthcare in Wandsworth. And we're about to roll that out into Merton as well. But there's more we could be doing around discharge to assess. We recognise that as a focus for this year. We also have 7-day services. St George's are increasing discharge at the weekend from November. I think we've all realised that a lot of informal carers are around at the weekend. So really we should be doing the discharges at the weekend to enable those discharges to happen more smoothly. And a lot more services are open at the weekend, aren't they, which helps so that we don't have that sort of gap when someone's discharged. We have been focusing a lot on enhancing health in care homes this year, and I have to say it's a bit early days in terms of our outcomes, but we're starting to see reductions in our admissions to hospital, and in the last 2 months it was 20% reduction, which was really great. But obviously it's not winter, but it is showing some impact, which is really helpful. Okay. Yes, enhanced care and care home seem to be twice there. Apologies. Right, let's move on to the next slide. So in terms of our priorities for 17-18 and plans for 18-19, our big focus is on reablement and intermediate care and how we can really bring that together in a much more integrated approach. We still have different referral points at the moment. How can we actually bring that team together in a much more integrated way and also commission in a joint way? I think that's a real strong focus. Equipment, we did have a new Section 75 agreement last year, but it does need tweaking. And there's lots more we could do to improve the recycling. Carers, you probably know, we had a strategy, a carer strategy last year, and we already have a pool budget for that, but really looking at how we work with GPs better to increase the number of carer consultations and increase the carer registration so that we really understand those needs and improve their health to enable them to care for longer and keep them healthy. Falls prevention, that's also within the BCF as a pooled whole budget. And we've been doing a review and redesign with providers. We've shown, and we've had a detailed review with public health, which has shown that we are showing impact on our reductions in hip fractures, but our falls admissions rates still remain high. We are going to be looking at the coding of that because we think maybe there's a little bit of a coding factor, but also there is something around the falls admissions that we really need to look at in more detail to change that service. Okay. So, challenges. Obviously, all challenges become opportunities. So I will start with the challenges and then go to the opportunities because that's how I am. South West London context is challenging with competing priorities within the local system. So I think we have to recognise that, particularly around the council makeup as well. We've already talked about the complex organisational boundaries. And I think really is the health and social care capacity to respond to increased demand. We're really feeling that in the community, and what can we do to really build up that capacity? There is an element of that that's through integration, but I do strongly believe that we need to be looking at the hospital and what hospital resources should be coming out into social care as the length of stay comes down. But that's very challenging to achieve. Obviously, workforce challenges are also very apparent. Recruitment and retention. We still have an ongoing use of temporary staff that we really need to recognise and how we can improve that because that is a cost that we can't continue to maintain. So yes, and obviously we've talked about the resources which are reducing under pressure or short term. And I think the level of executive sign-up in the past has been mixed, but I think we're starting to come together a bit more now, which is hopeful. So, in terms of the opportunities, hopefully South West London Alliance can support the integration across all the boundaries. I put it as a question, but I'm sure they can. And also the GP Federation, it does feel to be like an integrating force, as already they have got social care, health and voluntary sector services within their organisational structure. And as I've mentioned before, can integration be a way to reduce cost by increasing productivity and improve recruitment and retention? Wouldn't it be great to have some apprenticeships from a carer into social work, into OT, into nursing and physiotherapy? Another area that both Sydney and I are wedded on is really looking at the balance between bedded to home rehab. Have we got that right? It feels we have a very different... it's quite good when we've got Merton and Wandsworth to compare with. Merton have a much reduced bedded rehab to Wandsworth. And is that something we need to really look at and understand why that is? Is it history or is it because of the needs of the patients? So I think we really need to examine that in more detail. And what can we do to drive change in hospital provision and shift staff or resource into community settings, which really links to the discharge to assess process, where you're actually, instead of assessing people in hospital, you discharge them and then assess them in their own home. And who should be doing that? Should that be the community services or should that be the hospital staff following those patients out? So really, can we work together to build capacity in the voluntary sector to improve take-up and self-reliance? I think we've started to do that really, haven't we, through the prevention strategy that we're working together with the council on, and there's more that we can do on that. So, next steps. Integration has started to show an impact, particularly in the enhanced care pathway example, and also within the GP Federation. The challenges are opportunities also, and the proposed health and care plan that is to be signed off by the Health and Wellbeing Board can be a useful mechanism for agreeing and delivering shared priorities. And at this point, is it also an opportunity to bring the BCF into a wider borough-wide planning process, and that would require an additional programme board? or actually Sydney and I were talking about whether we need both, but I think we probably do, but how we make that work. So we've got more senior sign up as well as more of a delivery vehicle through the BCF. Yeah.
Very good.
Are there any questions?
Thank you. Yes, I'm sure there'll be lots of things to discuss. Josh, did you want to? So just remind us where we need to get to at the end of this discussion, first of all, to focus our minds.
So I think for me it's it's reflecting on the enormous amount of work that's gone so far and thinking forward as to further opportunities and ways of strengthening this cooperation. But I think it is also useful to unpack. We might use health and care integration as shorthand. Underneath those few words is an enormous amount of work and quite complicated partnership arrangement and a lot of money. So it's definitely something that we should all be as aware of as possible.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Okay, so any initial thoughts on that? Sam, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful in terms of giving that overview. Thank you very much. And I guess the things that were coming up for me were around where the strategic leadership is for this and what a model might look like, because what it sounds like is you've got lots of really good pieces of work going on around a particular area, but I can't see where there's a model that feeds into, or where the strategic leadership is to drive that. So I guess it's just, that might be something that we can think about in terms of how that leadership might look going forward.
So a week or so ago, we had a meeting, a seminar meeting with members of the Health and Wellbeing Board and other partners to discuss the health and care plan, which I brought to the last governing body. What was agreed there was one of the main. So the health and care integration was both an enabler and a priority almost. So particularly focused on older people, but in general, we need to use the assets that both the local authority and the CCG have collectively together. Now, the fact that's recognised as part of the Health and Wellbeing Board strategy and then the local health and care plan, I think helps us to lock in some of that joint senior commitment across the system. The point that Sandy made right at the end with reference to a more sort of strategic group is discussions with provider colleagues as well to adopt a similar approach and strategy as part of a single Wandsworth approach. So I think we're definitely getting there, is my sense. But I think we've got there partly because we've had some really big wins in this work to date, and that's been because of Sydney and their team and Sandy and team in the past.
Good. Andy, then Sarah. Andy, Steve.
So I think it's a really timely conversation on the back of the health and care plan update we had last time. So just 3 comments from me, broadly around the primary care angle. So a few of us last night met at the GP Federation in Wandsworth and talked about, I think, them and us working together to position them in a central coordination role, because a lot of this stuff flows through primary care. We've got the Federation who have been integral to a lot of this success to date, but trying to get them in a way that they are accepted as that sort of that almost local system leader and that coordinator, rather than in competition with other providers, so more of a collaborative approach. And that's something that we've agreed to commit to work on over the summer. And obviously we're talking to you two as well very soon as well around that. We think that will help, Sam, in terms of your question around the strategic leadership, so getting the providers together and using the Federation to help with that conduit. My second point is around primary care. So again, really none of this can happen without primary care and using the Federation in that role as well. And I think probably starting to socialise some of these with GP practices, because they might not necessarily have great visibility of it to date, but I think there are some areas that we will work on with the Federation where primary care have a direct role within that, and making sure that they are visible, and also starting to explore, as part of primary care at scale, what do you mean by networks of 30 to 50,000, and can some of these initiatives play as part of that, either in a clinical or a supporting role? And then just my third comment, which is when we started the ECP, in fact, even before we started the ECP 6 or 7 years ago, we looked at who we were presenting really, and at that stage about 25, I think 27% actually had depression, and now that number for the most vulnerable cohort has gone up to nearly half. And I know that one of the health and care priorities is around social isolation, so I think I would really urge that one, because it's often something that just gets hidden and it just becomes a statistic, but it is clearly a very important determinant of health and outcomes as well. So I think I'd urge that one in terms of a priority area too. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Sarah.
So I think health and care plans are key now. I think when we did the refresh of the STP for South West London, we recognised that actually local borough level plans are really important to what we do across South West London and how we build a kind of bottom-up approach. And I think that's the kind of future strategy for each borough. I think it's really important that integration is an enabler to deliver our local plans. And I think that from my perspective, it's how do we move from where we are now to a really complete health and care plan that not only informs kind of how we work together, but also things like estate, where we need to identify what do we need to do around estate for South West London, and we need locally to have a really clear plan about what do we want in localities, hubs, you know, local GP practices in order to deliver that, and we need that clear strategy to be able to make those decisions. So I think the health and care plan is going to be key here in delivery of our local vision, and also how all the enablers come together to deliver that. So integration I see as an enabler to deliver the better outcomes. I am interested in your South West London Alliance support for the integration across all boundaries, because the STP has been very clear. So I'm separating out the Alliance from the STP, because the STP is the strategic kind of intent for South West London, that it's a bottom-up approach and it's borough level. So that's been our refresh. The Alliance is the CCGs coming together in a management structure. What is it that you think could be different or supportive? Because you did put it down as a challenge as well, that it's not currently happening. Because obviously we want to be, all of us, because we are part of the Alliance, supportive in that respect. Yes. Yeah.
So I think the way it was presented as a challenge wasn't around the STP, it was around the South West London health economy and acknowledging the fact that there are different boundaries between different organisations, and just day to day practically that can make things challenging with people. So Sydney, for example's remit crosses both Wandsworth and Richmond. Now there'll be opportunities to that, to be able to share what's good in both boroughs and spread some of that out, but it also means that Sydney is spread thinner than maybe we would have liked, obviously, in a certain world. For the opportunities, I think so I think the framework that's set out by the Alliance is really useful, and it gives us as a collection of CCGs a certain amount of uniformity to the approach, which is really useful. And actually it's also useful that South West London councils, I think, in part have responded to that and have met together around certain things as well. So I think there's an opportunity to engage at that level as well as a local level to continue to support it. The other element is making sure that we use those South West London structures to share what's good across South West London. So we are already doing that to some extent around things like the care homes work, where we're borrowing good practice from Sutton and seeing how we can adopt it in Wandsworth. There are different things going on in different areas. In Kingston and Richmond, they have some experience of outcomes-based commissioning around certain populations. It's really that. But I guess it's recognising that a lot of the focus has been locally, but there is an opportunity in there to share learning.
Can I just come back on that? So thank you. I think any more that we can do at STP level, I think we do need to separate out Alliance from STP because they are slightly different. Any more that we can do at an STP level, if you can let us know kind of outside of the meeting, we'll try and put that in place. We're already doing some work with the councils across South West London, and we have some support in Sam, I don't know if you know Sam, who works for all the councils and supports, meet regularly with the leaders and so on. So I'm sure there is more we can do, but if we can maybe get some specifics, I'm happy to take that away and see what else we can do. Chris.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you very much for a very informative and very accessible presentation. Not everything we get here is as accessible or indeed as informative. I've just made 2 points, and I have a question. The first point to make is that your relatives' quotes, which you quite rightly highlighted, got me thinking, well, what about those individuals who don't have daughters and granddaughters or sons and grandsons? So just a question, okay, to put on the table. Secondly, this is a relatively small number, and I know you have to start somewhere. And of course, it's right and proper that you should start with a cohort of what is generally accepted to be the most vulnerable in the community. But for me, what all this indicates is that this integration nirvana, and I do have to say to you, this has been a stated objective for quite a long time. And me too, and I go back a bit further than you. So that said, we should recognise that every long journey has to have a first step. And I see this as a first step. What I think is my concern is that these organisational boundaries inhibit the logical progression of how services should be organised. Because at the end of the day, the acid test is how do the public receive these changes? Not how we describe them, not how brilliantly you present them, but how do ordinary residents that we're responsible for collectively actually see benefits and services. Now, how are you going to assess that as progress?
Oh. I mean, I think we have to look at asking what it feels like, and I recognise that the boundaries that we have are not, they won't see those. It will be the services that come to their home, or the services that they see and recognise in their local communities. So I think we have got to recognise that, but how we measure that impact, I think, has to be on their perception of the improvement. And I do know that when you talk to people, they don't see who is a social worker, who is a nurse, who is a physio. It's whoever is going to help me. And I think that's what we've got to work through as well, and make sure it's more joined up and not so repetitive in terms of assessment.
And there's a recent publication around the health and care area reviews. I think looking at where they've gone into different authorities and looked at where really focusing on the experience of the residents, the patients, around having health and care organisations that potentially are well-meaning and well-intentioned, but something is falling through the gaps. And I think it's around looking at, when we're talking about outcome measures, is not just being focused on what are the measures that are just sort of tick boxing, that we're sort of, as you said, well, we've got the pathways right, we've got the structures right, but looking at how do we get the outcomes of individuals, and that's a lot more difficult. But I think that will be something that we're looking at.
So, did you want to?
Yeah, I just was going to say that so this is the challenge that we all have, isn't it, across health, social care, but also across health services, to be honest, not just across health and care services. And there are areas where they've started, and this is the challenge that we are being set as well nationally, to say actually how are we going to work together in a different way in order to make sure we are focused on the individual and not on our organisational structures. And in some areas they have started to make steps forward in this, and in South West London we have areas where they've started to make steps forward in this. So Sutton Health and Care is now an integrated kind of model with all of the organisations in the area coming together under a contractual mechanism and MOU about how they will work together and how they will deliver services together. And we have got some of those mechanisms in South West London in different ways. So we're looking at different things with the GP Feds, as you know, in Wandsworth. So there are different mechanisms to do this. And I think it will be how do we bring all this together so that we actually ensure that the boundaries of the organisations isn't the thing we are focused on, but actually the delivery of the care that we are giving. So I think it's the challenge we all face.
Can I add? Because I think it's a really good question. I think there was some examples in the presentation of where there's been direct feedback around the feel of the services as a result of the change, and I think that's a big part of it. There's also a lot of data to show that people's journeys in and out of hospital, either there's less of them because there's more proactive care, or whether they're there for less long and there's more value. I think the other key indicator in here is how staff feel about the new system, because I guess for even individuals with relatively complex needs, going into hospital is a relatively unusual event in that it coincides with a deterioration. Obviously for the professionals working within it, that's what they're doing all day. And we've talked in this governing body before about how so many of the GPs around the room, other professionals in the system have said they found this way of working more coherent and more effective and more and enables them to give the best care to individuals. So I guess the challenge is, as we scale it up, how do we quantify some of that in a way that allows us to really clearly show the value? And I think particularly between the CCG and the local authority, if we can get that right, it really, really helps really lock in the commitment.
Good, thank you. Carol?
Thank you. Thank you for the paper, and there are lots of very positive things in it. My question is about the balance. You mentioned the balance of bedded to home rehabilitation and the possibility of moving hospital resources into the community as this begins to happen. My focus is on the patient or the individual here. If one goes too fast without the other, is there a question of feeling dumped at home without the appropriate rehab? And how is this going to work, and are the providers working with you?
To an extent, they are working with us. I think that we need to look at really understanding what we can have in place at home before we actually make that move. And that's hopefully that's something we can develop with the CCG mechanisms in terms of building a business case and looking at how we can invest to save and also to improve quality. So it's through our quick processes, really. But obviously we need to do a lot of, there'll be a lot of involvement and engagement with the general public about what this really means, and also to test out what we really need in terms of the support and enable that shift to happen. I mean, ideally, it would be something that we look at with the hospital and how some of those roles could actually move and change with us into a community setting. But it will be difficult, I know, because recruitment and retention is also very difficult in the hospital. But that's my understanding. But
Sydney, anything more to add?
I was just going to add that some of our bedded capacity, we have 8 step-down beds that are joint funded in the borough, and those have come up because of a gap in some ways in community services. And I think that when we're looking at our bed capacity in Wandsworth with health and social care, we're looking at over 60 beds and of sort of
56 we have.
rehab. Non-acute rehab step-down beds, and looking at most people would want their care delivered in their own home, and whether or not we have a high bedded capacity, both health and social care, because of gaps in our ability to provide more intensive support in people's own home, and whether or not there's a reinvestment opportunity around supporting more support to people, and not a lack of provision, and not people having a gap in services in their own home, but actually better support in their own home.
Good, thank you. So I've got Stephen, then Mike. Stephen.
My question was about the Better Care Fund, which you mentioned a few times. I've always sort of struggled a bit with the Better Care Fund as to what it really is, and is it, I mean, something we have to do, and it gives us some opportunities, e.g. some money, and you mentioned some of that. But I'm worried if it becomes the sort of the overarching brand or the overall driver of this, because my recollection is the Better Care Fund has very precise definitions, precise requirements which don't actually meet. I mean, there's reporting timetables which don't actually match what either the council or the CCG would naturally do, and there's a whole lot of bureaucracy around the Better Care Fund. So I think I wanted to distinguish, in my mind, I want to distinguish what we're actually trying to do, and and the Better Care Fund as a kind of possibly a subset of that, but as a techie bit of the architecture which we may have to, recognise and accept and live with, but we shouldn't let it sort of drive the thing. And I just want to be clear am I on the right lines?
yeah, I think that's definitely what we feel, the Better Care Fund, in terms of the way it's sort of it's been a tool, but it needs to be more, I think we need to recognise that it's got to be something more than that, more strategic, and how it works for us locally.
The implication of my question is actually keep it as a tool.
Yeah, we have to.
Because
it's mandated.
That branding is actually going to constrain us. Yes. So I keep downplay. I mean, pay obeisance to it where we have to, but frankly, it should be a small tool. That's all.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Josh, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. That's helpful.
Mike.
Well, first of all, thank you both for such a kind of informative and for me, simple to understand presentation. I know already a lot about what your role is, Sandy, but it's great to learn about Sydney's. So as a GP in the south and sort of south and east of the borough, I'm really aware that many of our practices have patients that live outside the borough, and Wandsworth, of course, has borders with 7 other boroughs, only 3 of which are part of our alliance, our STP. Although I'm aware of what we're doing in health to try to build alliances, I just wondered if you could help us out with how we build connections with the 3 boroughs north of the river and Lambeth to help us to make this happen.
Not to put me on the spot at all. I think that has been a real challenge, and local authorities historically in the past haven't really worked as closely together as you might think. We're not doing as much at the moment across the North Patch, but I think that is something that we need to have a look at, especially around sort of our Battersea end and people going into Chelsea and Westminster Hospital and people living in that sort of boundaries. We are starting to do a lot more work across South West London adult social services, and one example is something I've been involved in leading over the last year. It's looking at our hospital discharge offer across the 6 South West London boroughs and looking at can we align what we do to make to sort of, and then potentially be looking at if there's work that we can do on behalf of each other's local authorities. But just as the first step, that if a resident is admitted to any of our sort of 4 main acute hospitals, that the discharge pathway and the general offer from social care looks quite similar. And from a hospital's perspective, they're not having to sort of think through, well, which borough am I dealing with today, and which is the referral pathway, and what is the services, and what do I tell my patient. So I think there is starting to do some good work. I think there's definitely gaps in that around sort of key boroughs that need to start addressing to meet sort of all the borough boundaries. But I think it's the point around saying this is the start of a journey.
Can I go? Do you mind, Waka, if I go? And then I'll come to you. Thank you. Can I just ask you about, we've been trying to do integration for a long time, and it's not an end in itself. It's only what we want to do because we think it will make care better for patients, and because it may be more cost effective, which allows us to provide more services generally. So I think that's kind of important to flag, really. I just wondered about how we do this well in a kind of culturally sensitive way, because Chris started by saying, what about people who don't have a daughter or a carer or anyone? So there's kind of that end of the spectrum and people's needs there. But also, there are lots of different cultures in Wandsworth, and the extended family is really important in some cultures, and the care that's provided there. Do you know, what work are you doing to make sure that we get this right? Because it's not a one-size-fits-all package, is it really, by any means? Are we asking people along the journey, getting people's views of, how does this feel for you, I think is really important. But I think we might have to do some specific work to say, what does this community need?
I think that's something we will need to look at in more detail. I think we've been looking at scale, and we do need to look at the detail as well in terms of being sensitive to different groups, yes.
So on that, I think that we've got an opportunity, because I know that Charlotte Gorn we've had conversations about how we support the comms and engagement and the co-production and involvement strategies around the local health and care plans. And, I was going to come and talk in my exec report about how this is now very much a priority area that we've identified through the Health and Wellbeing Board for the local health and care plan. And I think there's an opportunity to get some really strong support actually from our Alliance-wide comms function in terms of making sure that we really build that approach in. So, I think let's take that one away actually, because you're absolutely right, and we've got an opportunity to get some really good support around that.
Yeah. And can I just add to that? So the Health and Wellbeing Board has a voluntary sector engagement subcommittee that I sit on that looks across the health and care plan priorities, but obviously this is a major one. I think that's going to be a really valuable group to draw upon in terms of experience, because they're there to advocate for their users and constituents, if you like, as well as for their organisations. The other area, of course, the Wandsworth Care Alliance. So it's a service that we support, and that I think we, for this particular area, could be really valuable partners as we develop the integration.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. And just on a completely different tag, you know, the lovely graphs that you've got on the enhanced care pathway and the outcomes. So I think, obviously, these are fantastic. I think we need to make sure that we're not kidding ourselves about this, because statistics can, you know, tell a story which may not be necessarily true. Yes. So, you know, there's something called regression to the mean, which might be that these people were going to stop having admissions and attendances anyway. It might be that actually it's all because those people that were very frail and actually got to the end of their lives and they weren't being admitted anymore. So, do you know, I think we need to make sure that the evidence base for this is absolutely sound, and I absolutely believe it's made a huge difference to patients. I can see that from where I'm sitting in general practice. But let's make sure we're not complacent about this. Is something that works. We need to keep evaluating it and make sure the interventions, which will be constantly tweaked and changed, make sure they really do have the outcomes that we want them to have.
I'm very well aware that GP Federation are looking very, very closely at the ECP and how you can develop it in a much more specialised focus as well, and how the multidisciplinary teams can work in a much more streamlined way, is my understanding. And I think in terms of the scale as well, I think we have to look at that. I agree that it's only 500 patients and we need to catch people sooner before they become quite sick, and what we can do in terms of prevention and also treatment in a joined up way that still makes sense from a cost effectiveness way, and then that's quite challenging.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah, Andy.
Andy, was it on that? Yeah.
Just
okay.
very briefly, because we wanted to do 800 patients last year, but actually we found that you got to a point after 500 where you were starting to over-service, and that's where the evidence around regression to mean really kicked in. So 500 on the top tier, and obviously we've got thousands below it. Impact is about the right balance for us in Wandsworth.
Yeah, no, absolutely, thank you. Waka, last one, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for a great presentation. I echo the clarity and the you know, the powerfulness of the presentation. This is a question that I have. You've described lots of purposeful activity that's been planned for integration, and you've demonstrated some great ideas that are in the pipeline, and you've shown evidence of great outcomes as well from the graphs, if they are to be believed, which I think they probably are. You know, you've kept a lot of people out of casualty that may have ended up in casualty for no fault of their own. And it seems to me that one of the limitations to integration or progressing ideas is that you can have a good idea and you just want to run with it, but finances is the problem here. And what I mean by finances is agreeing a budget and then sharing the finances across different organisations. Now, I do get that there is a statutory obligation for both organisations in the way they can spend the money. But if I asked my mum and dad in the street, you know, or any other person in the street and said, look, you know, what do you think of these ideas? They'll say, this is a fantastic idea, let's run with it. And then we'll say, well, there are financial difficulties. They're going to say, well, okay, the local authority has money and the CCG has money. Why can't we run with this idea? So I'm just saying that the general public may not appreciate the statutory limitations. And I just wondered, and there may not be an answer to this, whether there's been any workaround to try and minimise this limitation that currently is in place and stymies our ability to really be creative in what we can do. I mean, there may or may not have been any progress over that, but just wondered if there has been. You could share that with us.
So shall we get James to answer this one? James?
Yeah, so I mean, the Better Care Fund was partly designed to address that. So the Better Care Fund required both local authorities and CCGs to pull together a certain level of expenditure to incorporate services that worked on that health and social care integration area. So in a sense, by telling us to bring a certain pot of money together and for it to encompass those services, they've effectively compelled organisations to enter into some level of sort of pool budget arrangements. Now, you know, existing services and contracts continue within those arrangements, but at least it does give you the ability to have a conversation and say, well, you know, given that we have to spend this amount of money within the Better Care Fund, can we begin to shift some of those bits of expenditure? And I think that we've seen that around the margins, you know, we've been able to look at areas where we can sort of shift bits of expenditure to prioritise doing the right thing. Notwithstanding that, I think that, you know, it is very challenging to take that to the next level, which is a sort of full pooled area, because, you know, you do have very different systems of accountability and governance, and the democratic decision making around NHS funded services is at a certain level, and the democratic decision making around council funding of services is at a different level, and we have to respect the sovereignty of those two bodies. So I think we look to do the right thing. We use the BCF, as Stephen says, as a tool to enable us to do the right thing where it's appropriate as well. And we will look for other areas to bring it together, but equally we need to be just very clear what our remit is as statutory bodies, and just be quite respectful of that at the same time.
Okay, final from Huda.
So the board have been asking really probing questions around outcomes and impact of this work. And we know from years of experience of working together, I worked with Andy Flack from years ago, trying to evaluate things that are like multi-agency, that are very complex, cannot be done on the back of an envelope, and they require capacity and expertise. So my point is, how are we utilising the networking in South West London and HIN to maybe put in place some really robust evaluation from the start, so we're clear on delivery objectives of these and systematically evaluating this so we can gain confidence that we are making a difference.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good point. I think that there are a number of opportunities. One is, how do we work across South West London STP level to provide, how do we work with public health as well across South West London, because I know that we have a kind of network of public health directors as well, and how we work together. But the HIN, the HIN, the Health Innovation Network, I think is a real opportunity for us that in South West London we haven't maybe taken advantage of in the way in which we could. So I think we could look at the options or opportunities to see whether there's anything that they could support us with on this to help us to identify some of the work. They obviously have a very particular remit, so they may not be able to, but I think definitely it would be worth looking at.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. So, well, that was a kind of fairly wide-ranging discussion. Thank you very much, everyone. Is there anybody? So, Malik, you're our only kind of, external guest here. Do you want to say anything about all that?
I was just very pleased at the end of the challenge around cultural adaptation. Our population across the patch is increasingly becoming diverse, and the social complexities of the monitoring community centre. I think Josh mentioned the group we brought together around the monitoring community centre. And just in Wandsworth alone, there's over 1,000 social networks, community organisations, faith groups. And actually, we're only going to deliver this manifesto if we unlock the capacity that is held, not necessarily within the system, but outside the system in terms of the capabilities. So I think there's a huge challenge in terms of how we invest and unlock that. And I know James does some work with us in relation to co-production. So just slight anxiety that very little of that is being presented and thought about. None in the presentations, very little in the papers. When actually that is the direction of travel around unlocking capabilities, that we actually need to do much more thinking around, much more development around, much more shared knowledge building around, much more workforce development around how staff in the organisation see the work that they're doing in much more complex ways as opposed to a limited system way. So there are challenges.
Yeah.
I think we're going in the right direction.
Yeah.
I think some of the challenges that the board are presenting are the right types of challenges, and some of the works that we're doing on the margins are the right work. I suppose the challenge is how quickly we can scale that into the centre against the pressures that we're facing.
Yeah, no, so, and I would absolutely agree with that. I think in terms of maybe on the list of opportunities is, what opportunity do we have here not to just provide services for people, but do it in a different way with people. I think that might be kind of a real opportunity, actually. Good, okay. Josh, do you think you got out of us what you needed for that to be able to, with your teams, take this work forward?
Yes, thank you, and a couple of actions as well. Always welcome,
Great.
obviously.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Indeed. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay. So we're going to just go through our management reports now. Oh, sorry, guys. Yes. No. Yeah. Thanks very much. Go through our management reports now. So we've got the executive report first of all. Happy to take this as read, or any questions on it. James, anything to
I mean, I think that the only thing that I just wanted to flag, following on from the discussion that we've just had, is really around the Health and Wellbeing Board seminar. Those who attended, who sit on the Health and Wellbeing Board, knows that it was a really constructive discussion. We identified a number of high-level priorities which led on from the work in the paper we had last month, and include health and social care integration, around the age well agenda, and also looking at social isolation support to carers as well, which I think is a really interrelated area. And we are establishing a transformation group for Wandsworth, which will include both provider and voluntary sector representation to talk about how we operationalise that, how we develop the concrete plans that sit underneath those high-level priorities, and how we make something that really runs across all sectors and all partners within the borough. So I think that's really positive. As Malik was here, I was going to ask him whether there was any update on the HIN bid as well, around the latent TB. I'm presuming there isn't, because I haven't heard anything. But so just to flag that we've supported a bid from WCEN around getting real community involvement and co-production around increasing access to latent TB screening, which we know is a key priority for the borough. We know that we can work with communities, and I think that's a really positive step forward in terms of getting to some really practical and concrete areas that we're working with that co-production agenda. So that was always going to flag.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Yes, of course.
We haven't included here or elsewhere on the agenda a sort of update on Alliance STP, stuff, which I think the idea was we would routinely have, if only a sort of just where things have moved in the last month or so.
Yeah, I need to find out what's happened to that, because it did go to Kingston and Richmond CCGs yesterday, so I'm not quite sure why. We might have done something with our circulation. What I will do is the paper that went to Kingston and Richmond yesterday, I will circulate outside of the meeting. It just gives an update on the 5-year forward view areas that we are looking at across South West London, so primary care, mental health, urgent and emergency care, those kind of areas. I will get that sent out to you, and we will make sure that at every meeting you will get an STP. Just need to be clear, the Alliance is the management structure of the 5 CCGs that are working together. The STP is where we look at the South West London strategic intent and how we work together collaboratively. So it's the STP piece. We're not actually going to bring anything formal around the Alliance, because it is just the management structures that we're using to deliver the day-to-day. So, but we will bring something back to every meeting, and I will circulate outside of the meeting the thing that they had yesterday in other CCGs.
Okay,
so apologies,
perhaps
probably my fault.
Well, perhaps we could put on our management report template just to have it there, and then
Yeah.
drop it if there's no update of it.
Yeah.
We'll include it, I think.
No, we'll make sure there's one at every.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. And performance report, John. Anything?
Thanks, Nicola. I'll take the report as read. There were a few priority areas I wanted just to briefly update on beyond the information in the report. The first area was A&E, so a very strong start to the year with both April and May performance exceeding the planned target performance at George's. June has been marginally below, less than 1% variance between their achievement at 94.08% and their 95% national target. And the Trust are doing a considerable amount of work, some of which we updated in the previous meeting around the 15-point plan and around the very early winter planning process, which is probably the earliest winter planning process I've seen, but a very helpful lead-in time now to look at those opportunities around reducing length of stay, improving pathways out to community services, linking partially to some of the things we talked about earlier in the meeting. And also a very comprehensive piece of work looking at their breach analysis and looking at how the actions they put in place to respond to those categories of breach are helping performance in the emergency department. There is a bigger piece of work again heading into winter, looking at a system pressures dashboard, which looks at all agencies, all organisations that have some impact or some role to play in either people attending the ED or people seeking routes of discharge. And again, as we go through the summer, that piece of work and the numerous data feeds will be completed ahead of any winter pressures. I wanted to update also very briefly on the electronic referral system. St George's, as of Monday, moved to something called paper switch off, which essentially means that all routes of referral are now through the national electronic referral system. So paper-based referrals, faxes, emails, etc., no longer accepted. There's a very sophisticated and comprehensive safety net process around this. So if any GP did refer using other routes, then that referral is returned and the referral is made correctly using the ERS system, and there's resource to support that system. I think overall it's been a successful launch. There have certainly been some technology issues which we're working through, and now we've got till October to the national contractual deadline for full utilisation of ERS to work through any of those initial teething problems or any residual issues that happen going forward, and we'll bring a more detailed update to the next governing body on both the implementation and the performance against that. But we're looking now to achieve 100% performance, as in every referral going through the electronic referral system from July onwards, and certainly by October that will be then the national requirement. And finally, just in terms of IAPT, we're very marginally below where we need to be in month one, but just to update that we're doing a piece of work now with those practices in Wandsworth that provide IAPT services to make sure that data completeness and data quality, which had been an issue for some practices last year, affecting particularly recovery rate, which is quite an elaborate reporting mechanism, is addressed. So from September onwards, that data will be fully reported.
Yeah, I mean, just on the ERS implementation, I mean, this is something that's been a sort of technical process that's been running for a while, but obviously built towards an expectation that St George's would go for ERS switch off at the end of paper switch off at the end of June and ERS implementation. John and his team and Dr. Jonathan Chappell have worked tirelessly to get practices in Wandsworth and also supporting into Merton into the right place. And actually our ERS utilisation improved from being in the sort of 30s at the start of the year through to, you know, kind of high 60s, low 70s on the day that we went for it. And we know that actually there's some technical issues with the data that means that we were probably in the sort of mid-80s if we were reporting in the 70s. So I just wanted to put on note that actually there's been really strong clinical engagement and particularly from Jonathan Chappell some really clear leadership in general practice, and note my thanks. And I also at the last aligned senior management team, that was noted from the South West London wide programme director as well. So just wanted to put that on record.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you to all involved. Any questions on the performance report? Sam?
Just a couple of things that sort of jumped out, and I just wanted to ask whether or not we're confident that St George's have got a good process for understanding their demand and capacity. You know, it came up in a couple of sections here around cancer, ENT, general surgery, and at the CQRG, the last CQRG, I didn't feel hugely confident that the process was in place for understanding their demand, and it felt a little bit of a reflex response to demand.
I'd say that it's an area that we're continuing to work on them. I mean, to get to the position that we're all very familiar with in terms of the non-reporting and also the significant backlogs, you know, clearly there's a number of areas where the system's been running with an imbalance of demand and capacity for a while. We've got an elective care recovery programme where we're working with them on what they need to do in order to both bring the backlog down and also to be able to return to reporting. And part of that is to say, right, what is your understanding of demand and capacity? What are the specialties where we continue to have a knotty issue where, you know, we know that the waits to get in for first outpatient are very long? Actually, ERS is really useful for that because it gives us a lot more visibility, because with ERS, we know when we know when the next slot is, and so we can go back to the trust and say, well, actually, you know, the time that the next slot isn't coming down, so we know that you have a demand and capacity issue. So we have the right form, we have the right process. I think that both us and the Trust would say we've got more work to do, particularly with some of those most challenged specialties, to make sure that we have a really robust model that we both agree with and that we understand. So I think it's a fair challenge.
Good.
I was just going to add that we've spent a lot of time looking at the validation, and now we're moving on to as James says, that demand and capacity balance, and that huge opportunistic benefit of using ERS is that it does give that transparency, and we're a few days into the full use of it. So I think we'll see some benefit shortly.
Good. Thank you very much, John. Neil, do you want to do finance report?
Okay, thanks, Nicola. So you'll notice it's quite a slimmed down report at month 2. I think obviously a reflection of the very early time of the year when acute data is just starting to flow through and also prescribing data as well. So at the moment we are just forecasting to plan. And I think the report just takes you through some of the planning assumptions just to reinforce those planning assumptions that we've made at the start of the year. I would like to just draw your attention probably to the front sheet in terms of the QIP, that post-board sign-off we've actually increased the QIP plan by £1.5 million, which is to cover the potential for the RTT. So obviously noting the discussion that we've just had around the performance item, we're largely unsighted on when that is likely to come through or what that is, but we know that potentially there is a financial risk associated with that, so we need to plan accordingly. So that plan has been increased to do that. It is hopeful that by the time we have the Finance Committee in July, we'll be able to report that we've got a fully identified QIP plan. You'll note in the report it says there's a £2 million unidentified at the moment. I believe we're making good progress towards having a fully identified plan, but we'll get that ratified through the Finance Committee and reported back here. Also to note that we managed to get all the QIP into the contract, so there was an issue particularly last year where we had a large amount of QIP sat outside of the contract, which does create a large level of uncertainty. So at least by having it in there we can be a lot more visible about what's driving some of the overperformance if we're seeing that coming through, or underperformance if the QIP is overachieving, which is obviously what we hope will happen. We are continuing to develop pipeline schemes which are predominantly looking at 1920, but that equally will be looking at anything that we may be able to bring forward into 1819. And that's going through the strategy and planning group, so that's where we do the scrutiny around that, and then when it might be an in-year opportunity we'll bring that to the Finance Recovery Oversight Group that looks at not only the QIP but also the general financial issues that we might be seeing coming through in year. So I think the other risk that, so the QIP risk clearly is the big issue, RTT is the other issue as well. Acute always presents us with a problem. We're on PBR contracts still with all our providers, so I would say they are the 3 main areas, but at the moment we are reporting to plan. But I'm happy to pick up any other questions anybody's got from the report, recognising it is a little bland this one.
Early days, yeah, thank you. Anything, Chris?
Not so much on the report as such, but either Neil or perhaps James may want to comment over the question of risks. I wouldn't want the board to be under any misunderstanding about the comfort on the reserves as referred in here. It's talking about the scope of being able to draw on the reserves because of any QIP under delivery. What's not explicitly stated here is that our ability to deploy those reserves may be constrained by other problems elsewhere within the alliance, and I think that should be clear that we don't have unfettered access to these reserves as I understand it, but I'm happy to be persuaded otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, we'll discuss this in more detail later, but clearly as the financial regime develops within the NHS, we're in a funny situation where we are trying to manage statutory organisations and have a greater expectation of how we manage things as a South West London Health and Care Partnership. So we will need to work through the implications of some of those, and we're looking at how we're building up the governance around that, so we can do that in a very open and transparent way, and we will bring that back to a governing body in September and October. But clearly, we will be expected to try and manage our system control total, and we will have to think through how we work individually on that.
Can I just say, I don't want there to be any concern around the use of reserves where needed for Wandsworth. So Wandsworth is the statutory body. If there was a cost pressure in Wandsworth and the reserves were there to cover it, then that's what we would do. That is absolute. There's no issue around us saying you can't have access to those reserves. The Wandsworth governing body is the statutory body and makes those decisions as an individual governing body. It's not made at another level, or there is no other decision making on that. What we are saying, I think, is if there were an opportunity for Wandsworth to be able to retain some funding without having to spend it because all the CRIP delivers and the reserves aren't needed, then we might say, please can Wandsworth retain that, so that if we have other CCGs that are having problems, that you don't spend that immediately, and then maybe leave it, particularly if we've got more risk in the system for Wandsworth, such as RTT, for another year, hold on to that for the following year. That's the kind of thing that we'd be talking about. It wouldn't be, you have a cost pressure, we need to spend that money in order to cover that cost pressure, that there would be any kind of retention at a South West London level. We just cannot do that, and we would not do that. I just want to be clear on that.
And also, just to build on that, we won't be moving any money around the system. That's the other key principle.
Yeah.
So,
Good. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you for that. So, shall we do the Effective Commissioning Initiative update? Jonathan, welcome. Sorry to have kept you a bit. Do you want to nudge forward a bit?
Yes. So you need the
please come in view.
Yeah.
And would you use that mainly for the video? Thank you.
I'll try to. Can you hear people hear it? Yeah, good. Small enough room, I would hope. So, welcome. Nice to see you all. So I'm here to talk about a piece of work that we've been doing at scale across South West London, and one of the first pieces of work that we undertook across the whole of the 6 CCGs in South West London, as an example of joint working and some joint success around that. And there are 4 aspects to this piece of work. The first is an update on the Effective Commissioning Initiative policy that the 6 CCGs signed off at Committees in Common back in November last year. Associated with that, the next is an update on the prior approval scheme. So this is the practical implementation side of that policy. A bit of an update on individual funding requests and where we are in that process, again signed off at Committees in Common in March of this year. And then some of the practical implications for that in terms of activity and QIP impact. So those are the 4 areas I'm going to touch on. So I think it's really important to start by saying this piece of work was driven from a quality perspective. It was really about ensuring patients didn't have ineffective procedures, and that was at the heart of what we were doing around this piece of work. I think the paper also says it has had other quality impacts. So, for example, some of the trusts have fed back that junior clinical staff are in a much better position to advise patients on whether they will or won't have access to particular procedures, because that's much more clearly iterated and written down in a policy context. So the paper sets out what took place at that Committee's Common, and then what was agreed and implemented in January of this year. The next section of the paper, in sort of 2.3 and 2.4, talks about the London-wide work. So a lot of this work has been taken and used across London to inform the work that's taking place to try and get greater alignment across all 32 CCGs in London about how we do things together. And as many of you will have seen following the national publicity in this area last week, that will now be expanded to include some of the work that is taking place. I think the national consultation actually think launches today, on 17 areas of clinical practice, of which 15 are already in our policy and aligned to our policy. There's 2 areas, I'm happy to talk about those if people want. One's shoulder decompression and one is cysts on the eyelids that are not in the in our policy, but we expect that they will be in our revised version of the policy that we're working through over the coming months. So we will develop a version 3 of the policy aligned with what the national consultation concludes, hopefully, aligned with the London work and aligned with changes in technical and clinical practice that have taken place over the last year. So on to the practical implementation side of this. So as people are aware, we're working with the GP federations across South West London and the commissioning support unit to provide this service. And so far, about just over 9,000 patients have been through a ECI process across South West London. The paper gives some details about which CCGs and which trusts and what the volumes of activity have been for those organisations, which again I'm very happy to talk to. In terms of quality, I think it's well worth noting that for 9,000 patients, only 9 have sought advice from the service, from the clinicians in the service about why their referral was not subsequently supported, and only 1 of those resulted in a formal complaint, and most of those, including the formal complaint, were right at the start of the process. So I think that shows, allied to the fact that we know their average turnaround time for this service is under 24 hours, that it's a streamlined process that gets patients effectively to where they need to be treated quickly. So that's where we are on the ECI process. On the IFR work, as I say, we agreed that at a March committee in common of this year, and the thrust of that was streamlining what takes place across CCGs at the moment to move ultimately to one IFR panel. That process is underway. Carol Vallenham and I are interviewing this afternoon for the IFR panel chair, along with some clinical colleagues. So I just wanted to bring people up to speed on where we are putting that in place. And the intention is by September, we will have one IFR panel for South West London rather than the 3 that we currently have at this point in time. And the final section is on the impact in terms of activity and money. And you can see across the 6 CCGs, the volume of work undertaken against the 50+ procedures that policy covers has reduced by about 2,000 cases. And you can see that the financial spend in this area has reduced by around £3 million. So it has had a real impact in the last 12 months. You can also see what that looks like on a CCG by CCG basis too, in terms of spend in those areas. And of course there is some natural variation you would see, but you also see across all 6 CCGs a downward trend, a significant downward trend through the last financial year. I think it's fair to say in some CCGs, including Wandsworth CCG, there is further opportunity into 18-19, and that is included in your quick plans. You can see that just by the volumes of activity that are going through some trusts versus where we are with St George's, linked to some of the challenges that were just touched upon earlier when you were asking us about demand and capacity issues at the trust. The final section just summarises where, by procedure type, we've seen the biggest changes. And as another governing body pointed out, I thought it was quite important to note that some areas spend has increased. I think that demonstrates the policy is working effectively because it is around quality. So I think that's quite important to note. And then just a summary of the impact that this initiative has had, which I think really ensures that patients get consistent access to services across South West London in a way that they haven't done before. And it would be fair to say CCGs, or rather even PCTs, I think this had been talked about probably for a decade. So it's really good that we've got this into place, benefit in the last financial year, benefit in the coming financial year, and I think benefit for patients in terms of timely access to the right procedures for them. So I'll stop there and let people raise any points they want to raise. I'm not so surprised Dr. Williams wants to make a point, given her proximity to this work.
Indeed. Thank you. Nikki, yes, do you want to?
I think firstly to just confirm everything that you've said, also to say we've had a lot of positive feedback from general practitioners on the new policy. One about understanding when these procedures should take place, but also about ensuring that patients get correct initial management very early on in the pathway, rather than them being referred for a procedure waiting for a long time. They're actually started on the correct treatment much earlier in the pathway, so lots of positive quality impact for patients. Reiterating the fact it's not a fixed policy. It's going to be constantly changing. You know, evidence changes, things move along quite quickly, and to say, you know, some of the problems we've ironed out already, if you know, have been highlighted. We've picked up issues and ironed them as we went along. Also to say that what South West London was very heavily represented in the London work, probably most represented, so we have fed in quite a lot, and there are some new, and also to say we also fed into the national stuff. And fed our feedback to the national stuff. I think, and very quickly we're able to do that. But also to state the fact that I'm not sure when it all came out in the press yesterday, it quite clearly enough said that these are policies already exist and have done for, I can't remember how many years, but a very, very long time. And we're just trying to make them clearer and more succinct, and it's not about stopping people having stuff that they need. It is about quality.
Absolutely.
So could I just ask a bit on that, because one of the things, and it's probably not borne out by the statistics that you're giving us actually, but one of my concerns is about the ECI process, which is now not so many things. Sorry, the IFR process. Not so many things go through the IFR process, and previously through the IFR process, the vast majority of things that went through there were not approved anyway, were they? Is my understanding. So, is there any way of understanding of those things that now aren't going through that, whether they are simply not being referred at all because GPs recognise that there is no exceptionality here, they don't fulfil the criteria, or are they actually going through the prior approval process and being done, whereas actually in the past they weren't? So is there something, so kind of some reassurance on that? I hope it's the former, actually.
I think it's...
So I think all the evidence we have is it is the former. We were asked yesterday, and I think it was a really good suggestion by a GP to check whether there are areas that still would suggest clinical practice needs to change, and share those back with individual CCGs and individual localities actually within CCGs. So I think that's something that we will do, and I'm happy to commit to with the team. I think as there's greater clinical understanding both in primary, secondary care, and it gives clinicians a lever to say to patients quite clearly whether they're likely to get access to services. That's a big driver behind the reduction in individual funding requests that we've seen. And I also think by standardising things across South West London, we'll probably be in a better place to spot those trends that you were alluding to, and see whether we're on top of them and whether there are specific issues that we need to address. But I think we're now under 100 referrals per annum going through the IFR process across the whole of South West London. So that's part of the reason we want to streamline that process too going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this work it's gone in the really right direction. I think I'm kind of really happy with the way that it's gone. So thanks to everybody involved. I know a lot of people put a lot of work in on this. Carol,
I was involved in a lot of the working groups on this stuff, and one of the things that struck me was the variations between different CCGs on the prevalence of different procedures that could not be explained by demographics or anything like that. And, there were instances where it was suggested that somebody liked doing a particular procedure and lots of people were referred to this person who liked doing that procedure. And when you looked at the thresholds, they didn't make sense. I suspect that there are other areas of practice where there are similar differences in how procedures of various sorts are taken up, referred, carried out, and that there might be further scope for doing some of this work on a quality basis. It simply doesn't make sense that some patients are having X done and others aren't, when the clinical evidence isn't there that it makes the slightest bit of difference, or even that it's negative.
Yeah, James?
So, I mean, I've got the advantage of being in my second system that's gone through the process of implementing this now, and I certainly say that's right. And actually, sometimes it can come down to the same clinician working in two different settings, because clinicians work for multiple providers, and you may actually find that the application of a threshold is different depending on where they're picking up the referral, whether it's within a certain sort of NHS-based provider or whether it's an NHS-funded within the IS as well. So lots of things can account for that difference. I think what will be absolutely critical is to have the process in place to make sure that we continue to identify further areas that we consider for inclusion in the policy, and typically the drivers for that tend to be either you notice that you have a change in activity pattern, so a new procedure comes online, or also continuing systemic review of new NICE guidance, because actually NICE have a really systemic process around a lot of these areas, and actually one of the things that you need to constantly be looking at is, are you complying with NICE best practice? And are there actually areas where you should be thinking, well, do we bring this through into our local policy? So I think your hypothesis is right. The challenge is always how you get the kind of systematic view of everything you're commissioning, and saying, because there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily have a defined pathway for, and we don't need a defined pathway for, because they're not sort of contentious in terms of the clinical practice. But we will need to have that process of continuing to say, are there further areas that we look at, and we have that in place.
Good, okay. Mike?
Thanks, Jonathan. I just want to give a clinical perspective. So, as a GP working in a large locality, communicating with lots of practices, over the years I've been doing this, I've had a lot of feedback from practices about the difficulty of some of the ECI, or applying some of the ECI criteria. I just want to say thank you to Nicola, to Nikki, to your team, and those across South West London. The feedback I now get is so positive around the clarity, and that's the difference. So that it can introduce significant conflict in consultations between patients and practitioners, and between primary and secondary care, when we don't understand how these rules will be applied. As Nikki said, that these aren't new. I remember taking part in one of the very early iterations of this before 2010. What's really helped now is the clarity and the consistency. So I just want to say thank you. It's one of those good news stories, I think, that's really made a difference from the day it was introduced. So thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that too, and thank you for the work of colleagues in Wandsworth CCG to support it. It's really helpful to hear that feedback, as it were, from GP practices, because that's really important that we hear that and adopt that. And to Carol's points, if there are other areas, GPs are the natural people, or in their gatekeeper role, are probably able to point us towards what those additional issues might be. Yeah. So much appreciated. Worth getting on the tube for to hear that, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've got Eileen, Josh and Natasha waiting. Eileen, do you want to go?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to check around the patient feedback that the 9 patients that had contacted the team, was that 9 proactive patients that proactively contacted, or was there a wider check feedback from patients around maybe their views on the process and why they were not referred? So just to understand a bit more on the 9 patients.
So the 9 was proactive patient feedback, often instigated when, particularly in the early months. So I would say the vast majority of those patients, more than half, were in the first couple of months when this was bedding in the hospitals. And, you know, frankly, we should be welcoming the fact that we're getting that feedback. You know, that's what we want to hear, whether patients have had a challenging experience or not. It's also why we put in complete clinical oversight of the process, which obviously was quite an expensive way of doing this, but we felt was the right way of doing it.
I guess my point is around what about the others who have not been proactive enough to come forward? What is it that we are doing to seek views? And I think Mike's point is right around there's clarity. So we want to understand that actually because there's clarity from clinician point of view, they're able to explain it properly to patients. And that's the reason why we are not getting the feedback, but we just need to understand that there are no patients out there who haven't been proactive in coming forward, and therefore.
So I welcome views from directors of quality across the CCGs about how we do that.
Nikki,
Thanks.
did you want to? So I don't think we've actively sought patients'
No, we haven't.
feedback, but what we have done is develop a patient leaflet. So at the very start of the patient journey on this process, if they're being referred potentially for a procedure that falls under this, they receive a leaflet explaining the process, and I haven't got the leaflet with me, but there is something within it which gives them the ability to feed in if they have questions. But we haven't actively sought their feedback on the process.
Okay. Josh.
Thank you. So I think today NHS England launched a consultation on what they're calling evidence-based interventions work, and looking through the consultation document, there's just as much in here about the how as well as the what, and I think a lot of the lessons we've heard from the presentation talked about today have been how is it best implemented and monitored and encouraged, and I was wondering whether or not we should be putting together a South West London response to the consultation document on this basis, because I think we're well developed, and looking in the document, I think some of the suggestions they're making probably aren't quite in line with our preferences, I think.
So I think it's important that we're doing what's right for South West London too, in this process. But I think what I think I heard Nikki and Carol saying is we've preempted that anyway by trying to input into both the regional and then into the national process. You're right, we should feed, particularly as we have this extensive experience now over the last year that has not replicated everywhere. We should feed formally into the consultation, Josh, and I'm sure we will.
Okay. Can we make sure that we do that then? Thank you. Natasha.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. It's just good to hear that the clarity has been helpful, and that but there's been clinician oversight. Because I guess one of the questions I had was to ensure that there wasn't patient and clinician conflict, or as Mike said, between primary and secondary care, that patients are still being referred on symptom basis and are being offered alternatives rather than saying, well, there's no X anymore. You know what I mean? Rather than it coming from a procedural perspective, that it's still that. And I guess my question around that is that, and maybe this is not the right forum, but has it been looked at about how those funds locally are being then redirected to be able to manage the things that patients are presenting with, rather than it being that there's no more knee arthroscopy. I know that might sound like a banal question, but that's the first thing. And my second thing was a point just to Carol as well, was about the variation, which I think nationally that's been seen as a huge area to be looking at getting it right first time, and as James mentioned, the nice guidance as we can bring all these things, and actually to look at the positive outliers as well, so that how that can inform the ones that are perhaps a bit more wayward. So sorry, that was my initial question. Was about
So I think inevitably when we talk about this, because you're talking about a dry policy document of 100 pages or whatever, we end up talking about the procedures. But in all the literature and information that we've shared around this, and indeed what you've heard from clinical colleagues around the table, I think today, is the patient is still going to be assessed in the round in the holistic way that they should be about what is the appropriate service. I actually think it's reduced Normally when you have opaque and vague systems, the risks for confusion either between primary, secondary care or for patients is increased. And I think we've actually managed to reduce that because we're much clearer about what will and won't happen, and therefore you're able to talk perhaps much earlier. I'm not a clinician, but I would hope you'll be able to talk much earlier about what is an appropriate course of action, given some of the procedures that were on this list were clearly not effective. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
That sounds slightly qualified.
Sorry, I've got something just to add. I can probably
Yeah.
slightly add to that, that in each of the procedures where it's appropriate, we've put a whole section on primary care recommendations.
Yeah.
So it comes back to my point about patients getting the appropriate recommended initial management, and actually potentially not then sitting on a pathway waiting for a procedure that they shouldn't be having. But also we've made it very clear to primary care that we don't just refer for a procedure, we refer for advice, so that patients still are able to go to secondary care or to the most appropriate people like pain management or physiotherapy to have those appropriate treatments. And part of the other work we're doing in plan care is looking at how we bolster those other things to support patients in that more conservative management.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. So we've got final comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so when I first came into post, I spoke to the chairs, the 6 chairs across South West London, and said, what is the one thing that we ought to do across South West London if we don't do anything else? And the answer was this piece of work. It was, actually, this is something we should be doing across South West London. It makes absolute sense. It's the right thing to do for patients, and we should make that happen. And we have, and I think that's huge thanks, and I will say again to Jonathan and the team, but also to all of the people that have been involved, particularly those sitting around the room again today. This is the start of a process, so it's 1 year in, but actually this is an ongoing process. What we'll be doing is, as you say, clinical practice moves on all the time, and actually now that it's working, we need to ensure that we keep this up to date, that we show that it's a good process, and we can make this a long-term piece of work that makes sense going forwards. So I think it's important that Jonathan and the team also carry on, thank you very much, and also think about how we bring back the outcomes from that. And we could grow into some other areas. So one of the areas that I think we need to look at now is around how we do medicines management across South West London, and how we actually produce something not the same, but that we actually think about how do we treat people in the right way across South West London around our medicines as well as some of our procedures. But, yeah, good.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, thank you for that presentation of the paper. Thank you for coming, appreciate
Thank you.
it. So I think we're nearly done, aren't we? We've got the Finance Committee in common summary minutes and actions there. If anybody's got any questions or comments to make on that. That's all good, thank you. And a bit of time, if we've got any other business, anything anybody's thought of in the meantime, very good. And Caroline or Malik, if you wanted to ask us, or Ian, if you want to ask us anything. Anything for open space? No. All right. Jolly good. Thank you very much, everybody. Happy birthday to the NHS for tomorrow. I know lots of people are involved in various events, including judging cake baking competitions.
18 cakes in 20 minutes.
Oh my
That's
God.
to eat them all.
That's a good
twice the man you are now.
We'll need 2 spaces at the next
Yeah.
meeting.
Move along.
Your capacity right.